Have you ever been confused about how to choose the best fly line for your next fly rod? Did you know that line companies typically overweight lines out of the box to help us out? And are you interested in learning about the process of getting the perfect line for the exact situation you will be fishing this year? Today we take a trip back into Scientific Anglers so you have a clear path of selecting the best and perfect line for your next big trip this season. This is the Wet Fly Swing podcast, where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to give back to the fish species we all love. Hey, I'm Dave, host of the Wet Fly Swing podcast. I've been fly fishing since I was a little kid. I grew up around a little fly shop and have created one of the largest fly fishing podcasts in this country. I've also interviewed more of the greatest fly anglers and R&D program managers than just about anyone out there. Josh Jenkins, R&D manager at Scientific Anglers, will shed light on what's new this season and some of their best-selling fly lines. You're going to get some background on the core and the coating and understand how this will help you understand which lines to choose. You're going to discover how to match the leader with your fly line and why the leader is essentially just a mini fly line. We're going to get into that today. And we're also going to find out how and why you should be choosing the fly line first and matching your rod to the fly line. Better put, we're going to show you why fly, leader, line, rod, and reel is the order you should follow. Josh clarifies it all today. Here we go. A trout fisherman from Idaho turned into a Michigan warm water fisherman and has a passion for permit. Josh Jenkins from scientificanglers.com. How you doing, Josh?
I'm doing well, Dave. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in here for the podcast today. We're going to do a little bit of an update. I think it might be even a deep dive on Scientific Anglers, some of the lines. You've got a background, I think multiple degrees in the field that kind of puts you in a position to be the best person to talk to. And Scientific Anglers is awesome because it's such a long history in fly fishing and all that. So we're going to talk a little about that. And we recently had Bruce Richards on a while back, and he passed the mic to you. So first off, how did that go on the mic? You received in the mail. You've got this mic. You're sounding good.
Yeah. Bruce is a dear friend of mine. I hope you would say the same about me. My predecessor, and when I first started at SA, he actually came back on board on the payroll for a couple months to train me. So we have a great relationship, and Bruce is a dear friend, and I definitely consider him a mentor.
Nice. Do you, with Scientific Anglers, do you know the whole history? Obviously, Bruce, we talked about that on that podcast. We'll put a link to the show notes, but are you aware of the whole history of SA?
Probably not to the same extent that Bruce is, but we were incorporated in 1945. We're based in Midland, Michigan, which is also the headquarters of Dow Chemical Corporation. I can actually see them right across the street right now, literally across a highway. And in 1945, there was a couple of gentlemen from Dow that spun off and wanted to start building fly fishing products. I believe the first product that SA introduced was actually a magnesium rod tube. It wasn't for a few years after 1945 that we actually started building fly lines. I don't think it took an incredibly long amount of time, but eventually we started building fly lines, and that became sort of our hallmark product. And our founder was, the biggest thing with SA was designing the machines that made fly lines with a plastic coating where the coating was actually tapered rather than having a tapered core with a sort of consistent layer thickness over top. So that was sort of our claim to fame.
Gotcha. Yeah. And your current role, maybe talk about that. What is your current role with SA?
Yeah. So my technical title is the research and development manager. It's a little bit more complex than it leads on. I'm essentially the only product developer and engineer in the building. So I'm responsible for designing all the lines, designing our accessories, sourcing leader and tippet. And then I also get heavily involved with production from the engineering side for process improvement, things like that with our production equipment.
Gotcha. And it seems like there's a lot these days with lines. I mean, you can go back in the past and see there were less lines, I'm assuming, back in the day, but now it seems like there's a line for every species. Is that, like, when you look at what you have going, are you always thinking ahead, like, okay, what's that next random species that is kind of getting popular? How do you choose where you're going next?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I listened as a preface to this. I listened to Bruce's interview with you.
Oh, good.
I think you guys did it a couple weeks ago, and everything he said was exactly true. I mean, when fly lines, when SA developed this method for creating machines that created taper coatings on plastic fly lines, it really opened up this whole door of possibilities with tapers. And Bruce sort of touched on a few things, how when in the early days it was cam driven and it was pretty expensive to change the taper of a fly line. Now everything is computer controlled, but that's sort of the stark difference in Bruce's career, and I think anybody after him, including me, is that the fruit that's left over on the fly line tree isn't so much a taper thing as much as it is technology in my mind. It's the taper exploration, the physics that determine how a fly line casts and how a taper affects how a fly line casts are fixed. Physics is it's a law of nature. It doesn't change. So, if a taper was good 20 years ago, it's still going to be good now, which is a little bit limiting in my job in this day and age because we have, to your point, already so many tapers between us and all of our competitors that the innovation left in fly lines in my mind isn't really a taper, it's technology. It's making a fly line super slick, super durable, more buoyant, clear, whatever. It's more in the technology than it is the taper.
Gotcha. And in that tech, I mean, I guess those are some of the questions that come up. I mean, you guys have obviously been doing this a while, so you kind of stand out there on some of the products, but maybe talk about that a little bit on the product line. So, and let's just break it off by species a little bit. We're going to get into your background too in a little bit, but right now you're kind of in the Michigan area. Smallmouth bass is on our mind because we're going fishing there. Let's just start off there with the line that you'd be using for smallmouth. If we were heading out there, to fish with Schultz or whoever, what are we using out there?
Yeah, so the taper is going to be pretty easy. I use two throughout the year. Our most popular is by far the bass bug, which is probably the most versatile. It'll allow you to carry large streamers, large hair bugs like a Dahlberg diver. So I would say probably 70 to 80% of my year is with that taper, the bass bug. And then we do in Michigan, it's actually pretty interesting as the summer sort of wears on and frogs become less available, the water gets lower and clearer. We actually start fishing pretty small bugs, sometimes just like a normal trout hopper almost. There's a really popular smallmouth fly called the old Mr. Wiggly. And the bass bug taper will still cast those fine, especially if you lengthen your leader a bit. But if you want to fish in a more finesse manner, usually I'll drop down to something like Grand Slam or Infinity Salt Taper, which are actually saltwater specific, but the coating holds up fine because the temperatures in Michigan in the summer are fairly hot.
Gotcha. So yeah, talk about that a little bit on the line. So you have specific lines to the warmer environments versus colder. Maybe talk about what you have going there, what somebody should be thinking about. Does that make a big difference on the line you choose?
Sure, yeah, it makes a huge difference. So the fly line really has two major components. There's a core, which is what provides the strength to the fly line, runs through the center. If you ever cut off your loop or something like that, you can sort of see it in the middle of the line. And then over top of the core, we apply a coating. And the combination of the core and the coating determine how stiff the line is. And you really want to match that stiffness to the temperature that you're fishing in. So if I were to go out and make a trout line, I'd want to pick a supple core and a relatively soft coating because a trout line is going to be fished anywhere from, freezing temps up to probably 80. A soft line is great for those lower temperatures because you're not going to have a ton of memory. The problem with the soft line at higher temperatures is that they actually get too soft. So if you take a trout line and you fish it in a tropical scenario somewhere, 85 degrees Fahrenheit plus air temperatures, what you're going to notice is that coating is going to start to feel sticky. It's not going to shoot quite as well, and it might actually be too limp, which will cause tangles on its own. So in that scenario, we'll actually increase the stiffness of the core and increase the stiffness of the coating for tropical lines. And then in the case of a line like the bass bug specifically, it was designed to sort of bridge the gap. So in that line, we use for lack of a better term, a freshwater core that would normally be used for a trout line and a saltwater coating that would normally be used for a tropical line. And it sort of gives you a medium temperature line, if you will.
Gotcha. So the supple mixed with the stiffer coating. Basically, it makes it in between. So could you use that line? You could use the bass bug line for tropical environments.
You certainly could. It's not going to be optimized for it though, so I wouldn't recommend it. Most tropical fishing is going to involve a pretty large expense of travel, either getting to the place you're going, and then once you're there, oftentimes you're paying for a lodge or at least a couple guide days. If you're going to go through all that expense, I would just suggest getting a normal tropical line, because it's probably going to be the cheapest portion of that whole setup and travel anyway. But yeah, it would certainly work. I mean, I fished the bass bug here in Michigan and 90-degree temps and it still works fine.
It does. Okay. Well, good. I'm glad we started with that. We've got a number of trips we're doing around the country, mostly kind of North America, although we are going to be heading to Belize. So I'm always interested to kind of think about that. But, between steelhead, Atlantic salmon. So we'll kind of jump around a little bit today, but let's take us back a little bit on your start. How did you, before you came into SA, how did you get into fly fishing and how'd that all begin?
Yeah. So I have an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. Through the course of that degree, I had a summer internship near home at a place that was making electrical measurement devices. And it was actually a really cool job, and I enjoyed it a decent amount, but I wasn't necessarily passionate about the work. And I graduated and I took a full-time position there. And it was, after a year or so, I was like, I'm pretty young in my career. I don't know if I want to relinquish myself to doing this for the rest of my life. I want to try something new. And in my mind, the easiest way to do that was to go and get a master's degree. So I applied for a program out in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon. I got in, finished that degree, and then it actually took a while. But for the first year after I graduated from there, first 6 months, I guess, I told myself that, I'm fine with not having a job, moved back in with my parents, which I'm not necessarily proud of, but it is what it is. And I took those 6 months and just applied for everything that looked interesting. I've always been a fisherman. I've been fly fishing since I was about 13. I think fly fishing was probably top of list for me as far as industries to get into, but I would have taken, just about anything like mountain biking or hunting or anything along those lines, traditional fishing even. And I applied to a bunch of jobs, and I eventually got a call back on one that was a reel designer at Orvis. And I interviewed there, and it ended up not working out. I think they lost funding for that position and ended up putting the responsibility on someone else internally. But I stayed in touch. Orvis has owned SA since about 2013, and this job came up, and I reached back out to my contact at Orvis. We had still been talking in the course of not getting the Orvis job in this one, and I applied, and the rest is history.
So that's it. So you got your education, then came into fly fishing after a little bit later.
Correct. Yeah. SA is my first fly fishing specific job.
Amazing. Yeah. What has that been like? We've talked to a lot of people on the podcast, people that have been longtime anglers and people that are, brand new to it. And they're always interesting stories. What's the journey or the learning curve look like for you getting into fly fishing?
Getting into fly fishing or getting into a fly fishing career?
Yeah, just actually, I'm assuming, you do some fly fishing now, right? Just the actual fly fishing, the casting, the everything. I'm sure from your perspective, you're probably maybe different than some people because you're working with one of the big companies out there. But yeah, what does that look like? How are you feeling? Are you how many years have you been doing this now? Is this pretty new?
I've been at SA almost 9 years.
Okay, so it's been a while, yeah.
Yeah, close to a decade. I got my first fly rod, I think I was 12 or 13. It was an Orvis Clearwater outfit from my parents for Christmas. Fishing has always been a part of my life. Up until I was 13, it was a lot of gear fishing, with bait casters and spinning rods. I think I actually probably annoyed my dad to no end when I was really young because obviously couldn't drive, and every weekend I wanted to just be out on the water. When I was 13, I got my first fly rod, and I fell into that for a few years and then sort of fell back out of it and got really big into bass fishing once I could drive, just because it was the closest thing I had to me from my parents' home. And then in college, I got sort of flipped back. I went back into the fly fishing realm, and then ever since I've been at SA, it's predominantly fly fishing.
Okay. And so that's cool. And then now you're in Michigan, you were in Idaho. We just drove through Idaho on our way back last week. And, there's lots of good water all around the country. But what has that change been like for you kind of doing the Idaho to Michigan? Is there a big difference? Lots of similarities?
Yeah, I would say it's probably more different than it is similar. So in Idaho, it was a lot of trout fishing for me with a fly rod specifically. I did a little bit of bass fishing and pike fishing with a fly rod, but being relatively new to the sport, every fly shop that I went into in my hometown of Coeur d'Alene essentially focused mostly on trout. So it was interesting. I was a little bit worried when I first moved to Michigan because we have some hallowed trout waters here. You have the Ausable, you have the Pere Marquette, but it is certainly different. The fishing can be good. A lot of it's at night, and I'm not really much of a night owl. I value my sleep too much to stay out that late. But the cool thing to me moving here was getting exposed to warm water fishing. Even within the reach of SA, I could leave my office right now and within 20 minutes be on a smallmouth river and catch a ton of fish and probably not see another human being all day. And I think that was the coolest thing for me, was just exploring new fisheries in my new home state of Michigan, and then the travel that the job has afforded me as well internationally.
Yeah, that's it. Where have you traveled? What's that look like? How are you choosing the trips, or does it depend on what line you're working on?
Yeah, so it sort of depends on the reason for travel. They would kind of fall into two buckets. One being development, which really only happens when we have a big program that we're working on. Most of my travel would probably fall more into the trade show bucket, which is, you're traveling, you go into a trade show and then you tack on a few days of fishing. So I've done that in Austria, I've done it in Norway, all over the US, Florida probably being my favorite when iCast was still down there, or when IFTD was still with iCast. And then a couple development trips to places like Mexico.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, let's get back into a little bit on the line. So we talked about the smallmouth bass line. What is, for trout fishing, let's say you're back to Coeur d'Alene or you're fishing for your typical trout, do you guys have a bunch of different lines, or what would be the general kind of all-purpose trout line?
Yeah, probably too many, to be honest. I don't know the count off the top of my head, but it's, for trout specific lines, we've got to be close to a dozen tapers, maybe a little bit less. By far, our most popular is what we call Infinity. It's the most general purpose trout line we make. It'll cast anything from size 22s up to large indicators with double nymphs and even some smaller streamers. So that, if you're just getting into it, you only want one fly line for trout fishing, the Infinity would be the go-to for sure.
Gotcha. Infinity. And then rounding out the other 11 is basically depending on if you're casting big bugs or if you're casting subtle dry flies, or, what are the, just, you don't have to speak to them all, but what are the big differences? Like, why would you go to something else other than the Infinity?
Yeah, so the way I would characterize our trout lines is, so the coating in the core is the same across essentially all of them. We divide our fly lines into families based on technology. So if you move up or down a price tier, you'll get gains in slickness and durability, but they all have the same suppleness, more or less. So from a taper perspective, the difference from Infinity is essentially if it's either more finesse, so if you want to consistently throw smaller bugs, or if you want something that's more aggressive for consistently throwing large streamers or large indicator rigs. So, for example, we have a line called the Anadro indicator, which is sort of the go-to for a guide boat that's throwing indicators all day. They're very unlikely to throw dry flies, something like the bread and butter Missouri River for the guys that are mostly throwing indicators. And then we have a line called the Trout line, which has been around forever, which is extremely finesse. It's very good for small dry flies and long leaders, but it's a bit hard for novice anglers to cast because it's so finesse. So it really depends on the rig that you're going to consistently throw, or the range of rigs that you're going to consistently throw, and then your casting ability. And if you sort of take those two axes, you can narrow in on what taper would be best for you.
Stonefly nets, nestled in the heart of the Ozarks, Ethan, a master craftsman, dedicates his skill to creating the finest wood landing nets. Stonefly nets are more than just nets. They are part of our story, each cast and every cast. Ready to make your fly fishing trips unforgettable? Visit stoneflynets.com and discover the difference of a handcrafted wood landing net. Drifthook is your trusted source for high-quality flies that level up your fly fishing experience. I use and love Drifthook's hand-selected flies, and they offer a money-back guarantee for any reason if you're not satisfied. You can order today right now at drifthook.com and use the code SWING at checkout for 15% off your next order. That's Drifthook, DriftHook.com. Check it out now. And what about now? It's 2024. We're going to be coming up to 2025. Every year, do you have new lines coming out, or what do you have in anything you can speak to now? Or when do you announce the new lines?
Yeah, I mean, most often we'll have at least a couple new lines. This past year was a pretty heavy focus on saltwater. We actually launched a completely new program of clear floating fly lines this past year. Our cycle generally starts around July. Historically, we've announced new products in July at ICAST, and then those products are usually available for sale at the end of October. So our new products for, technically, we call it the 2025 selling cycle, are going to be available here in another few weeks, but they've been announced and our reps have been traveling and presenting them. It's a fairly light year of new lines for us. One of the bigger programs we have is a new series of lines for GT fishing. And then a couple other sort of smaller programs on the side. I think there's a couple sinking lines in there as well.
Gotcha. How many, obviously trout is the big, I'm not sure what the market share is, but it's probably something like, the 80-20 rule or whatever. But what is GTs, or any of these things? Do you guys have a good beat on what percentage of anglers are going for GTs? Like, it seems like some of these species would be, very small and maybe there wouldn't be quite as big of a return. Or how do you guys determine why go with a GT versus, say, a peacock bass line or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a constant struggle for us. So one issue is, figuring out if we can sell enough lines for a specific scenario like that. The other issue is naming convention. Actually, naming a fly line is very hard. So we at SA, we hold ourselves to internal MOQ, which is minimum order quantity. So we basically say, hey, if we don't think we can sell this many lines in a year, this program's probably not worth it. And so with new programs, it's a little bit of a finger in the wind. You launch a program, you have to see how it goes for a couple of years. If it doesn't hold up, then you cut it. If it does, you leave it, or, whatever. The other thing is naming scheme. Part of the problem that I deal with is on product development. Actually, one of the larger ones is naming, because you want to make a line easy to identify what it was designed for, but you also don't want to pigeonhole it too much.
Right.
More recent example would be striper line. So actually, in addition to the GT line we have coming out, we're coming out with a series of striper lines this year. And we've always had striper appropriate fly lines, but they've never had striper in the name. And because of that, we've struggled with sales a bit. So this year we're coming out and putting striper on the box. So a lot of these programs are small. You asked about GT. I would have to imagine it's somewhere, below 5% of our business, but we sell enough to meet our MOQs, and it gives us sort of a niche line that's, cool in consumers' minds, and it is a cool application and highly demanding. So even if you have a really small program, as long as we meet our internal MOQs, we're generally not against launching something.
Trying something. And that's what's cool about now is that back in the day, that might have been harder to do, right? What you're launching now, because it's all computer aided. And then, like you said, it's kind of similar to the flies, or maybe it's like anything in the industry where you test something and then you see, and if you don't have, over a period of time enough orders, you can just let it go and, and then focus on other stuff. Sounds like is that kind of how you do it?
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly it. Yeah. Sometimes we'll have more developed insight than that. It seems like kind of a caveman method for launching a line. We can base our guesstimate on how many we'll sell on a close equivalent taper, or, some line that we used to sell that we discontinued, but that's essentially it.
That's it. How do people, if they're coming in here, and obviously lines eventually wear out, right? I'm not sure how long it typically takes, but if somebody's getting a new line, where do they start? What would you be telling them? What should they know? How do they choose a line? What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, I think the most important tip I could give is be honest about your casting ability. If you're buying a line that's outside of your casting ability, you're probably not going to have very good time. And generally that means that correlates to how overweighted the line is. So this is sort of a gross oversimplification, but an overweighted line is always going to be easier to cast, especially for a novice angler. So I think the one thing I would suggest for someone who's new to the sport and looking for a fly line is to sort of get a base level understanding of the line standard weights for fly lines and understand how to read the back of a box and try to pick a line that is slightly overweighted, not too much, but just enough to help you. And then after that, you've got to figure out what size flies you're going to be consistently throwing, which is going to depend on the species you're chasing. And those two things should really help you sort of narrow into the line that would best suit you. We have an excellent customer service department here at SA. And if anyone has any questions, if you have any doubts about what the road you're going down in relation to picking a fly line, our CSRs are great. They'll always point you in the right direction.
Gotcha. Okay, good. So, well, let's take another example. Let's say, we are going to Belize here soon. If we're going down there to chase, there's a number of species there, but what's let's start there. What would be the line, the weight, and talking about are you also overweighting that a little bit?
Yeah. So our most popular saltwater line by far is what we call the Grand Slam. And the Grand Slam is overweighted by 3/4 of the size. So it's very close to a full size heavy. So if you buy a 9-weight Grand Slam, if you get a Grand Slam and on the box it says 9-weight, it's pretty close to a 10. And that is it's our most popular for a reason. It's the easiest casting, especially for novice anglers. A lot of people in this world, even in the fly fishing industry as professionals, they only take a couple saltwater trips a year because it's so expensive. And so to get really good at saltwater fly fishing, you have to have a ton of money. And to offset that lack of experience, it's easier just to get an easy casting line like the Grand Slam. So normally, if you're only going to take one line, that would be my suggestion. And then if you get enough experience that you feel like you want to try something that's a little bit more finesse or something with a longer head to carry more line out to your target, we have a multitude of options beyond that.
Okay, good. Yeah, the Grand Slam, we've heard lots about that. So the Grand Slam is good. And then what about, I mentioned this before, but just about the line, anything else people should know about these lines? Is the tech today where you just put on the line and you're good to go, or is there other things? Are we still needing to clean the lines? How long are people, any tips on, getting the most value out of these lines over time?
Yeah, it all depends on where you're fishing and how often you're fishing. I get asked a lot how long a fly line is supposed to last, and it's such a gray area that I can't give any definitive answer. But I can tell you definitively that cleaning your line and maintaining it will make it last longer than not, regardless of whatever scenario we're in. So I would suggest, as often as you are able or as often as you would like to clean your fly lines. Generally, SA lines don't need dressing, which is to say you don't need to apply a topical slickness coating over top because we build slickness into the coating of the line itself. It's always present. The problem is if you get dirt on the outside, you cover up that slickness. So you've got to at least clean it to get back to a new layer. But fly lines, I mean, actually when I was in Austria for that show, I had an angler come up to me and he showed me a 20-year-old SA line that he was still using. It was cracked as all get out, but it was still usable for what he wanted to do.